Once Trump realizes that, I think that will be the end of Vladimir Putin. That will be the end of Vladimir Putin. Because Biden had no idea how to deal with one of these people, one of these, patients of a burglar. If burglar was still alive, he would highly criticize Biden. He says, every time Putin provokes you, you give him, or you punish him, but only a little bit, halfway. You give a few weapons to Ukraine, only for Ukraine to survive, but not enough to defeat Putin. The consensus is that there is some kind of rationality to Putin. But again, this is like the consensus among the KGB experts, that the KGB would never join with the mafia in the early 90s. They were still writing this, only to later think, oh, I made a mistake. My personal view is that Putin is not acting rationally. I guess some scholar would come along and say he's in what's called bounded rationality. In fact, there was a famous scholar, Graham Allison at Harvard, who coined that phrase, bounded rationality, meaning that he is rational to a point. In other words, he's acting rationally given the incentives that he has, even if it doesn't seem like that for outsiders. Scholars will be debating this for a long time. But I think we can use what's called Occam's razor, that the most obvious answer is probably the correct one in this case. I don't think he's acting rationally, simply because let's just take one episode in his 25 years, which was invading Ukraine in a full way in 2022. In 2014, for example, one can argue that he wanted to show Ukraine, punish Ukraine in a way, when Ukraine only had 8,000 professional soldiers. So he only invaded Crimea and attacked the Donbass only because he knew the West was not going to react. Why? Because the West didn't react when he attacked Georgia. But then you wonder, why would he attack Georgia? Why would he attack Ukraine? But especially in 2022, when he sent his entire armed forces to invade all of Ukraine and thought that he could occupy a country and pacify a country of 35 to 40 million people with only that 250,000 army that he sent. It shows me that Putin is a brilliant tactician, but a very poor strategist, because you wonder, okay, he got away with Crimea, he got away with Georgia, and he got away with holding on to power, if that is indeed the goal that he has, to just hold on to power, survive politically, become as rich as possible, then we can say, yeah, well, he's been acting rationally. But then why would he invade Ukraine when he knew that it was a huge risk? When Russia potentially could be sanctioned, could be punished, where he would, if something went wrong, he could lose the regime. At that time, I remember my friend Mike Waller, he has the same Mike Waller who I discovered back in the early 90s, who was leading that project on the KGB, and Andrey Ilarionov both published an article in a think tank in Washington called the Center for Security Policy, where they were predicting, when all those troops were amassing around Ukraine, in Russia proper and in Belarus, that they will not attack Ukraine simply because President Biden was giving Putin everything he wanted. That analysis was very rational, and yet Putin attacked. And so that shows me that Putin likes to gamble. But that's the people who don't know Vladimir Putin the way I know Vladimir Putin. And I know a part of Vladimir Putin that the rest of the Sovietologists around writing about Putin do not only don't know, they don't want to know. I guess it's because it is a controversial thing, and those other Sovietologists, almost without exception, of course, they depend their entire career, their entire life, their entire income depends either on government or some think tank or academia. And they know that any second, any little thing they say which doesn't please the woke or politically correct crowd, they can get canceled. And many professors have been canceled for lesser things. A professor will say something, you know, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, canceled. And you always wonder, where do they go? You know, how do they make a living after they're canceled? You know, they go teach in a high school or they work in a warehouse. So they have to be extremely careful. And, you know, sometimes when I would bring up my by now well-known theories about Putin's psychology, I could see the faces of the other people in the room. And I was invited to a think tank, say, just one of many examples, the Atlantic Council, when we were talking about how to not only defend the West against Putin's propaganda, but how to strike back. And so the whole thing in the Atlantic Council, which is one of the leading think tanks in Washington, how to strike back. And it was full of very important people and former diplomats and former ambassadors in Russia, United States ambassadors and all kinds of people, State Department officials, and they were all talking about how we need to, you know, blah, the usual, which has not apparently worked so well so far. And then I was a co-sponsor of that, Democratizacja was a co-sponsor of that event. And when it was my turn to speak, I said, well, you know, we could always strike back in a very, very hard way against Putin to out him. And I don't mean to out his homosexuality, out his hypocrisy. Why? Because as a homosexual man, Putin attacks homosexuals. But that, again, is very typical of what's called a homosexual man in denial. And the people in that room, again, it was just complete silence. They were literally, their eyes were opening like that, you know. One of them even put her face in her hands demonstratively to say, I cannot believe I invited this person to speak among you, honorable, I'm so sorry, you know. She just put her face in her hands. The others, it was his former ambassador named Verzbau, right? And he just literally, his eyes were like an owl, like, no, you know, you're not supposed to say those things. The body language in that room was just perfect. But again, it's like, I don't know, medicine before the X-ray. And so the poor doctors were trained only in visible light to treat tumors or cancers, and they developed very good methodologies on how to, you know, detect these things. And here comes along somebody who says, well, I have this X-ray machine. But for some reason, the doctors don't want to use that X-ray machine. They, you know, because I heard it's, you know, whatever. It could kill the patient or something. So I almost feel like that doctor or who pioneered something new. And it's not that I'm smarter than the other people. It's just that I grew up in a very different household than those other people, number one. Number two, I don't depend on government, on academia, or on think tanks to make a living and to keep my reputation and my face, not to lose face. So I don't have to dance around the problem. I can say things which maybe one day people will say, I knew it all along, you know? What do I mean by I grew up in a different household? Well, my parents, both of them, who were erudites in psychology, and my mother had a PhD in psychology, specializing in abnormal psychology, taught at the university, published, you know, in journals. My father, though, never studied psychology, although some of the greatest psychologists never actually studied psychology, which is interesting. You know, Sigmund Freud never studied psychology. He was a medical doctor. So just to compare, psychology is beautiful because you don't have to be a psychologist to understand and even contribute to that profession. So my father wrote numerous books on psychology based mostly on Freudian psychology and Jungian. My father is a disciple of Carl Jung, and especially the Archetypes. So his life work, 50 years literally, and publishing a magazine and numerous books, was to further the archetypal theories of Carl Jung that Carl Jung himself never finished. Carl Jung spoke about archetypes, but never really classified them in such depth. My father has, again, spent his entire life doing that. In the meantime, they were also counseling gay men in denial in Mexico. And in those days, Mexico was horrible against gay people. Not as enlightened as, say, I don't know, San Francisco or Sweden or a place like that where they can live in peace. Mexico, they would be harassed. I mean, all the Russians watching this will understand what a homophobic society is. So I guess it all started with this doctor that my mother knew, and you know, he was a wonderful man, and he was gay, and he suffered. And when my mother was telling him, and they just met by chance because it was her doctor, and he would tell her all the horrible things about being a gay man in Mexico. And so my mother counseled him, and then he brought other people to my parents. They were in very bad shape, and I remember that. I mean, they would, as I mentioned to you before, they would literally just, pull out a cigarette and like this and shaking. And the first things they would say is, "Doctor, make me a goddamn normal. Make me a goddamn normal." Imagine the tragedy of these people. And some of them were famous. And I remember saying, well, yeah, I know this person, So anyway, based on those experiences in counseling gay men in particular in denial, and in other words, they had to deny their homosexuality because they would lose their job. They would lose, most of them were married, had children, but they also had a very active homosexual life. And so they had to have this sort of schizophrenic life. And of course that affects the psychology of any human being. When you deny, I would imagine that, I don't know, an Armenian living in the Ottoman Empire during, right before its collapse, in Istanbul had to really hide his identity, and every day looking behind his shoulders, and he knows that, all these Armenians were being killed in the eastern provinces, but he himself is just every day very scared to be discovered. And for that, I guess you have to read Anne Frank's diary or whatever. Imagine the stress of having this sort of, your life will any second come apart if you make one little indiscreet remark or mistake, and who knows, about me, who knows that I attend these parties, whatever. And, numerous politicians, have lost their political careers based on this. So, and they know that. And so when my father, in fact, was following in the footsteps of, and my mother both, in the footsteps of an earlier Austrian psychotherapist and psychoanalyst named Edmund Bergler. And Edmund Bergler studied under Freud, but unlike Carl Jung, who turned against Freud and developed other theories, Edmund Bergler stayed very, very loyal to Freud's basic psychoanalytic strategies, and ended up spending almost 40 years doing only one thing, and that was exactly like my parents, treating and counseling as a profession homosexual men in denial. And then he wrote several books. The two main ones I have right here, Homosexuality, and the other one is 1,000 Homosexuals. If you read these books, published in the 1950s and 60s, it is exactly Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. So that is how I come to the conclusion that Putin is not acting rationally. Something that Bergler discovered is that these gay men under extreme psychological pressure develop these psychopathologies. But the central psychopathology, as he himself says practically in every chapter of these books, is masochism. In other words, they provoke situations so as to be punished, and then they enjoy the punishment. That's where Freud comes in. Of course, this is unconscious, and that's why Bergler used the term psychic masochism. So it's not like in their frontal lobes they want to be punished. No human being wants to be punished. But back here, they grew up under such miserable circumstances that they developed what Sigmund Freud called pleasure in displeasure. In other words, they've learned to adapt to their displeasure because that defined their lives since they were young, even babies, because one of the theories is that the reason why they become homosexual men is because they were starved by the mother, they were abandoned by the mother, they were mistreated by the mother. So what Freud called the imago matris, or the image of the mother, is so negative to them unconsciously, because the mother abandoned me, the mother poisoned me, the mother, fed me a milk that was not real milk, or that, she gave me to some other wet nurse and I survived barely. As a baby, they were starving, and of course they don't remember any of this here, but they remember it back here, those traumas. So by the time they grow up and they become adolescents, they begin to notice they're not only not attracted to girls in school, they're afraid of them unconsciously. And so they just basically go with men because they find the men non-threatening. So that's the whole Freudian theory of why, men, homosexual men turn to homosexuality from their infancy. And so Burglar, staying loyal to this theory, noticed how his patients would provoke just incredible situations in order to be punished. And once they were punished, they would be like, poor little me, I'm always being punished for no reason. This can only happen to me. And then they have this sort of pleasure in displeasure because they've learned to adapt to those horrible, lives that they have, poor things. But there was never a case before of one of these profiles leading a nuclear superpower. So that's when we have to be, very careful how to deal with Vladimir Putin. And I've noticed that of all the commentary by all these Sovietologists that only have the visible light, not the X-rays, they're giving very dangerous advice, basically. Because what Putin is doing, he is provoking the United States to punish him. And in Georgia, in a number of other provocations. And if the United States does not punish him and backs off, then he provokes even more, because he feels almost insulted, again, unconsciously, that he was not punished. So he will push until he is punished, and then he will say, oh, why me, I'm always being punished. And so another strange thing that, just by reading Edmund Burglar, you will see Vladimir Putin in here. He even lists several elements of what constitutes the typical profile of one of his 1,000 patients, because that's why he wrote this book, because he claims he treated around 1,000 homosexual men in his life. Not only the common denominator of masochism, but he even breaks down many other elements. And if you add those elements to the other elements discovered by some of his followers of Edmund Burglar, including my father, you get to 21 ingredients. 21 symptoms typical of a homosexual man in denial. And Putin fits perfectly 20 out of the 21. And I mentioned this in my paper, which I published 3.5 years ago at the Center for Security Policy in Washington, together with Mike Waller, again, because Mike Waller is an expert on the history of the KGB. He, by the way, I didn't mention this before, but Mike Waller wrote the book on the post-Soviet KGB. It was called The Secret Empire. But anyway, Mike, knowing the history of the KGB, he brought to that paper not the psychological stuff that I brought, but the historical. And something that Felix Dzerzhinsky did on purpose was to hire, for the KGB recruit rather, gay men in denial in the Russian, from the Russian Empire, from the crumbling Russian Empire and the new Soviet Russia, because he knew that they were in a secret war, not only with themselves, but with society. Because society mistreated them so badly that they had this yearning for revenge, which explains a lot of Russian history. Why is it that you can order them to kill an entire, people and knock on the door at 3 in the morning and kill somebody in front of their family, or starve an entire Ukrainian village? That's not normal against your own people. But then suddenly with this X-ray machine, right, knowing the psychology of these homosexual men in denial, you realize that Felix Dzerzhinsky was an evil genius, because when he founded the Чрезвычайная комиссия, he staffed it with people like Vladimir Putin that he knew would take orders to kill, humiliate, steal, torture without question. Why? Because in their minds, they were seeking revenge for everything they suffered since they were adolescents in this homophobic society. What else has, the new people after Burglar brought to the table? As I mentioned, my father, he made a hybrid between two students of Freud, Burglar and also Carl Jung. So what does Carl Jung have to do? He wrote very little about homosexuality, very little. But what he did was archetypes. So taking those tools, my father, throughout many years, and published numerous books, but this one is the main one, about his experience in studying gay men in denial through those years of counseling them and trying to help them and noticing how difficult it was to help them. Because another thing that they do, these gay men in denial, and Bergler noticed that, they engage in what's called transference. Transference, meaning that when the psychoanalyst who's trying to help them, suddenly is viewed as the bad mother that they're fighting against, or the bad boyfriend that left them and humiliated them, or their wife who discovered they were gay and also left them. And so they're full of anger, and then suddenly they take it out on somebody like my father or somebody like Bergler, and Bergler is frustrated, but understands why they do this, and he spends a lot of time in his book talking about this transference issue, when he had to basically calm the gay person down in his studio, in his office, saying, look, I'm not your mother, I'm not that bad boyfriend that left you and tortured you or whatever, or gave you, this horrible, treatment. I am here to help you. And so, when my father wrote his books, he also reflected on this transference issue, because sometimes they would also, I remember, they would explode. Again, some of these became friends of the family for a long time. Others disappeared. One of them, coincidentally, looked exactly like Vladimir. I mean, he was the double of Vladimir Putin. Just by coincidence, but his facial expressions, his cynicism, that's why I was able to read Putin since the very beginning. And, the first article I wrote about Putin's homosexuality happened right after Yuri Shekashikhin was poisoned. So when I wrote a tribute to Yuri Petrovich Shekashikhin in Demokratizatsiya, because he was a member of our editorial board, by the way, I hinted heavily that Putin was a homosexual. In fact, I got a little bit of a slap in the wrist by other Sovietologists that read that article in Demokratizatsiya. They said, I don't think Putin is a homosexual because he's married. I mean, they understood nothing about where these people come from, nothing. So anyway, my father noticed that the people he was counseling, these poor gay men in denial, many of them wrote poetry, and he also noticed that the poetry and the writings and just the life of these gays was defined by 3 Jungian archetypes that are not so common in people and men who are not homosexuals. And that those 3 archetypes, those 3 Jungian archetypes, he elaborates here extensively. And guess what? Poison, puncture, mutilation. And it's not just my father who discovered this. Someone else discovered this before my father, which is interesting, but never really academically published anything. And that would be Scotland Yard in London. Scotland Yard. Apparently, back in the day, I don't know about now, but back in the day when Scotland Yard in London discovered the body of a man, stabbed multiple times, not once, not twice, but 20, 30 times, immediately they said, oh, this is a gay thing. And Scotland Yard would just go to the local gay, whatever you call them, leaders, influencers, bar, and say, okay, who's this? Oh, yeah, that's Jack. So when, again, Scotland Yard found an unidentified male body lying on the street or in his apartment that had been stabbed 30 times or had been poisoned, immediately they realized this is for the homosexual community, and they would solve those crimes because they would exclude other things and they would just go straight to the gay, their contacts in the gay community in London and say, have you seen this person? And they would inevitably say, yes, that's how they would solve the murder. Oh, the last time I saw him, he was leaving this bar with Bill, or with William, and they would go see William, and William, okay. And sometimes, my father even published this, sometimes Scotland Yard would find, the spurned lover still with blood on his hands. It's almost like they didn't want to hide their crime, He would have blood on their hands, and he was in this sort of state of post-catharsis, and sometimes he wouldn't even remember what he did. He would be like, oh yes, I guess I did, but I don't remember stabbing him that many times. And that's something that Bergler also had discovered, that these poor gay men enter into a state of such rage and jealousy and fear of abandonment and just they lash out. And even later, they don't know why they did that. So my theory, again, is that Putin, at some point, some of the worst things he has done that others ascribe to some kind of a rational pattern. Maybe he's rational, he's trying to intimidate, he's trying to test the West, maybe. But a lot of it we can ascribe to some kind of just impulsive, irrational fear or desire for revenge. And even after he made the decision, like attack Ukraine, later when he realized, oh, what did I do? He cannot say that, obviously. He has to continue saying, oh, but that's because they're Nazis. That's because of this, that's because of that. All the excuses that Putin has given for his attack on Ukraine, this latest one, the full-scale attack, notice how many excuses he's given that are completely contradictory of each other. Initially, it was denazification and because NATO, and more recently, he said, because I was bored and I needed some action, And if you look at another one of the multiple symptoms that Edmund Bergler shared about these gay men in denial, he says they're easily bored, but a boredom that is to such an extent, it's almost like this depressive boredom. And so they need to do something crazy in order to feel that, that their life is worth living, that they're excited, whatever. So it's this boredom bordering on depression, which he describes very well in his books, Bergler. So I believe that Putin was telling the truth accidentally this last time when a reporter, asked him a question and he just spontaneously said, well, I was bored and I needed some action. That's the closest thing to the truth that Putin has said about why he did this invasion. He is one of those homosexuals that gets bored to the point where he feels he's going to disappear unless he does what Bergler also called a herostratic act. Herostratos, of course, was this ancient Greek, 2,500, 600 years ago, who burned down the temple of Artemis in order to feel that he could live. Praslavitsia, praslavitsia is like to go in history as somebody great who did some great deed, even though that great deed was destructive. It was burning the temple of Artemis. Who does that help, But to that homosexual man, it helped a lot to Praslavitsa. So Putin could be invading Ukraine for the simple reason to Praslavitsa, to say, look what this great Putin did, look what the destruction he caused. He's trying to prove to his mother who abandoned him unconsciously, he's trying to prove to her, I was not abandoned, I have agency, I can do a lot of damage, mother. You see, Freud, that is classic Freud, that is classic Bergler. But then going back to my father's contribution, if you look at all these poems by these, gays, I put in yellow all the time they mention the word poison or something highly related to poison, such as scorpions, snakes, puncture, stabbing, the thorns of the roses, all these archetypes that have to do with puncture or mutilation. My father put a whole collection of homosexual poets that, based on his intuition, just by counseling these people, he noticed that they were obsessed with poison, mutilation, and puncture. Like Scotland Yard, they knew that, but they would use that as a modus operandi to solve their cases. My father put this in black and white in these pages. Fully half of these poems have the word poison in them. No, sorry, 2/3. 56 out of 82 of these poems, 2/3 have poison or some archetype having to do with poison. The others mention, mutilation or devouring or things like that. And those are the classic fears of a baby that has been highly mistreated or abandoned, or the mother just did not have the milk to keep him alive, and he survived just by some miracle because some aunt came and said, this baby's starving, let's feed him milk from the cow, whatever, and he survived, but he was permanently psychologically crippled. I believe Putin is one of those cases. Everything indicates that Putin is not acting rationally. He is acting on the basis of his neuroses, starting with the fact that he hates himself. And he's always trying to prove to the world that he has agency. That hating himself is called internalized homophobia. Exactly like those people that would show up at my parents' studio or house and smoking, chain smoking, and saying, make me a goddamn normal. In other words, they're not normal. In other words, they see themselves as something less than a human being because they've been conditioned all their life to think of themselves as garbage, as human garbage. And they believe it. It's called internalized homophobia. And Putin, I believe, has internalized homophobia, and he has all the classic symptoms of it. And the number one symptom, according to Edmund Bergler, was how he treats other gays. So recently I wrote a paper which hopefully will make it into the hands of people that are going to be dealing with Putin from the Trump administration, basically comparing Putin to Roy Cohn. Now, Roy Cohn was, of course, the lawyer of Donald Trump when he was still a businessman and a developer, and he got in trouble with the government because of something. So everybody said, oh, you got to go see Roy Cohn because that guy is a tiger when it comes to dealing with the stupid government, and he will threaten them, and he's just pure, evil against, and they're all scared of him. And so Roy Cohn, interestingly, he was a Jewish gay lawyer who hated lawyers, Jews, and gays. So that is, again, a classic symptom of internalized homophobia of a gay man who denies his homosexuality till the day he died in the mid-'80s of AIDS. He insisted he had liver cancer. And he slept with men, and he did this quite openly. But then he would say, no, I'm not a homosexual because homosexuals are trash. And I'm not a homosexual because I'm not trash. I have agency, I have power. To such a degree that we can still see in Donald Trump a lot of the advice that this brilliant tactician, highly masochistic, highly neurotic, Roy Cohn gave him. He says, in order to have super agency, again, in order to show that you are not going to be messed with, you need to always attack, always deny everything, and always make things look like a victory instead of defeat. And Donald Trump, being a non-homosexual, learned these tricks, these political tricks and business tricks, to this day, basically define who he is and his success in getting reelected, even after all those, the whole administrative state, the whole, deep state of the United States tried to destroy him. And thanks to Roy Cohn, he overcame all of that with these amazing tricks that he learned from his old friend and lawyer, Roy Cohn. So I believe Trump knows how to deal with Putin because, in his unconscious mind, I think whatever Putin does will remind Trump of Roy Cohn. But it's important to put that also here on his frontal lobes so that he realizes that Putin is another Roy Cohn highly neurotic, highly tactical, brilliant tactical, but horrible at strategy, and highly masochistic. Once Trump realizes that, I think that will be the end of Vladimir Putin. That will be the end of Vladimir Putin. Because Biden had no idea how to deal with one of these people, one of these, patients of a burglar. If burglar was still alive, he would highly criticize Biden. He says, every time Putin provokes you, you give him, or you punish him, but only a little bit, halfway. You give a few weapons to Ukraine only for Ukraine to survive, but not enough to defeat Putin. And then you're always backing off and you're always playing dumb. And that's the worst way to deal with one of these profiles. You need to show them that you're the alpha male. Once you show them you're the alpha male, you're the wolf, you're the alpha wolf, they will back down and they will even love you. They'll be a loyal person to you. Putin has even shown on many occasions how when he is beaten down, he will then lick your hand. One of the many times was when Turkey shot down a fighter jet, a Russian fighter jet that briefly flew over its territory from the war in Syria, and they shot it down. And then Erdogan, unusually, said, yeah, we shot it down on purpose, and we would do it again because they violated our sovereign airspace, NATO airspace. And Putin, after that, became almost enamored with Erdogan, and he would see Erdogan and get Erdogan's counsel and appear next to Erdogan. I think if Trump punishes Putin severely, if Putin survives politically, he will then seek Trump and be Trump's number two and proudly be, the indispensable number two of this alpha male that punishes me because he loves me. And that's another thing my parents, the people that went to see my parents, interestingly would describe their masochistic homosexual relations. When my parents would ask him all these questions, inevitably these gay men in Mexico would say, well, yeah, he beats me, but that's because he loves me. He beats me, but that's because he loves me. So in order to show Putin love, you need to beat him. And then Putin will lick your hand. He will go to Trump and say, I will do whatever you ask me to do. Unfortunately, Biden did not know that. I hope Trump does.